Under Plum Lake by Lionel Davidson. 24. The Billions of Worlds. He said there were 1,000 million stars in our galaxy, many with worlds. He said outside our galaxy there were 1,000,000,000 other galaxies, all with worlds, billions upon billions of worlds like ours. He said our world was a ball of rock, and everything we had out of the rock, the sea, the atmosphere, all the plants and creatures, they were made of it. Hot molten material had come out of the rock, and the steam from it had formed the sea, and the minerals in the sea had formed life. All life from the rock. He said it was still going on. The creation hadn't finished. The earth kept reproducing itself, like any of the creatures it made. It kept making new material which came up as molten rock and nudged aside old used-up material, pushing it under again for remelting. When it nudged a plate carrying land, you got earthquakes. But mainly you didn't, because most of the earth was underwater. So it mostly happened there. He said people above hardly knew about it yet. He said they knew hardly anything. He knew everything they knew above, and everything they had known. He told me how he knew it. He told me about their education in Egon. He said until they were 60, they hardly had any. They just had sport and art. They learned all the sports and all the arts. It's why they could do everything. He said these were creative things, so they had to be learned. You couldn't get them any other way. And it was all you actually did learn. Everything else was programmed directly to your brain. You got reading and writing fed to your brain, then communications and sciences and language. He said there was only one language in Egon, but they did everybody else's. They did all the languages of the planet, and of animals, and of other planets. He said he'd got all French in half an hour, and all the dialects of Asia in a week. He knew every language there'd ever been. I asked him what use they were, and he said none, but they didn't have to be, because once you started thought training, you could use any language anyway. He'd only had to touch my head, and he knew all mine. And when he was older, he wouldn't even have to do that. He'd just look at a person and know it. But you got the programs to work your brain and grow your mind. That was the point of them. And actually, it was the point of your life. He said your mind was your life. So the bigger... He said your mind was your life. So the bigger one you could grow, the more life you had. He said people above didn't understand it because they never grew up. They just grew old too fast and died while they were children with children's minds. He said their baby smashed violins because it was a baby. And all kids acted in a crazy way. But when their minds shaped up at 70 or 80, they began growing out of it. Except people above couldn't, because they didn't live long enough, because they didn't live enough yet to grow the right kind of mind. He said cavemen had the same kind of minds people had today, and they thought they knew everything. People always thought that. He said 10,000 years ago they thought it, and 20,000 years ago. When you looked back and saw they knew practically nothing, and what they knew was mainly useless, every few years they learned something that changed most of what they knew before. He said it had been the same in Egon. Egon had been discovered by a scientist called Glister, and they'd called the Glister Deep after him. He'd first discovered the deep, and under it, the abyss, and then a way through it to the caves of Egon. He'd been looking for energy materials that hadn't yet come out of the earth. They'd still used earth for their energy then, and it was millions of years before they learned how to plug in directly to the sun. He said it was millions of years more before even the sun's energy wasn't enough, and they thought they had moved to a bigger star. And it wasn't till after the mess-up, when the world had been remade in Egon, that they learned they didn't need stars either. Even the stars had to get their energy from somewhere. Everything he said I was understanding. He wasn't even saying it. He just thought, and I knew it. He was showing me their sciences. He showed me light science. He said a radio was a branch of light science. He said just as you sat in a house and tuned in the radio, you could sit and tune in light. You could do it anywhere. It's how they had the sun, moon, and stars under the sea. They had the receivers fixed high in the roof of Egon. They had them tuned directly above, so that as the earth turned, they had night and day and all the seasons. He said you didn't have to tune in right above, or even to the present time. You could tune in to any time, to anywhere. He said when you saw a star, you were seeing how it looked hundreds or thousands of years ago. It took that long for its light to reach Earth. The light didn't stop because you saw some on Earth. It kept going past Earth, past planets, past other stars. It kept going all the time. Space was full of light from all time. It only looked black up there if you didn't have the equipment to receive it. He said in Egon they had the equipment built into everything. It was how the roads and buildings lit up. It was why the metal glowed. He said he had it on the submarine. He lit up the sea with it. He hadn't switched any lights on. He just activated the light in the sea. I wanted to ask about the submarine, about how he'd got it and where he'd left it, but his mind was moving on. He said they had thousands of sciences, more sciences than I could imagine, like multi-gravity and anti-gravity. It was how they kept the roof of the sea up. He said you didn't have to know all the sciences, but when you were old enough, they fed you a few to see what your mind wanted. Until it was 180, it hardly knew what it wanted, because it was still being made, and every mind was different. He said, though minds were different, brains were all about the same. Brain was just basic stuff. It was like quartz or silicon that could be activated electrically, except what activated a brain was thought, which was faster. He said if you radioed a message to a planet 300 light years away, it would take 300 years. But if you did it on thought, the message got through immediately. He said all their messages went on through. They had experts in their thought institute in permanent contact with space. Their brains were trained for it. He said a brain was basically a computer that was programmed to make a mind and then act for the mind. It couldn't do anything by itself. For instance, when a baby was born, it saw everything upside down. That's why it had such a dopey look. It was looking through its eyes, and eyes were lenses, and all lenses saw things upside down. One of the first things a baby had to do was tell its brain to put things right way up. And that way, a baby's mind took charge of its brain and started growing. He said once your mind was grown, you could do what you wanted. You'd grown your life, your ego, you'd finally found out who you were. He said people above didn't know who they were, any more than ants did. Their minds were so small they had very little life, and even the bit they had, they wasted. They mainly spent it swapping things with each other and trying to get the best of a bargain, and then fighting if they got the worst of it. They never understood the point of their life. I asked him what the point was, and he said I probably wouldn't get it, but he'd explain a bit. He said living creatures had minds, but all things had brains. A piece of wood had one. Wood was just millions of atoms all racing round in a certain pattern, but what kept the atoms in the pattern was what kept the wood being a piece of wood. Otherwise, it would turn into something else or fly apart. Things had to have brains. In fact, the world was one. The world was a single huge brain that kept all its separate brains in order. He said, though the world was a complete brain, it was still only a cell in another brain. The galaxy was a brain too. It was one enormous whole brain and worked like one, controlling all the millions of worlds that made it up. But it was still only part of another brain. The universe was a brain, and it went further than that. Though the universe was a brain so gigantic, they hadn't even found a billionth of it yet. It was still only a bit of something else. It had to be. Brains were controlled by minds. There was a mind behind the universe. He was looking at me in a funny way as if he couldn't figure out if I'd got it yet. I couldn't figure it out either. I said, was this other mind God? He said he hadn't done God yet, so he didn't know. But the universe was all controlled. All the million galaxies were, all the billions of worlds were, every grain of sand was, and I was. That was the point of it, and it was why life was fun. I couldn't see where the fun came in, but he felt around in my mind and said he'd try a bit harder. He said it was hard to explain fun. He said an ant couldn't understand it, so it didn't have any. A rat understood a bit, and it had a bit. People understood more, so they had more, and that's how it went. The bigger the mind, the bigger your life, and the more fun you saw in it. But whether you saw it or not, the fun was there. Life was fun. The idea of it was, the universe was, and you only had to look up and see it. It was an enormous game that kept going on, and you were playing in it. Only people above hadn't glimpsed it yet. Just then, I knew I had glimpsed it. I remembered the feeling in the lake, that my life was something magic and part of a game I'd been playing without knowing. But I had no time to think of it. I forgot to put we'd left the caverns by then. We'd checked out below and checked out above, and he'd picked up the car, and he was still telling me things. He said people above would get the idea one day, but they had to get their minds bigger first. They had to live longer. They had to learn the medical science that would let them live first to 200 and then 300, and everything would follow from that. He said their history had barely begun yet, and he started answering questions I didn't even know were in my mind. He said no trace remains of their own history above, because they'd gone below before the planet looked as it did now. The mountains were worn down and built up half a dozen times since they'd gone below. He said the people had changed color from brown to white because the sun's rays were filtered out by receivers, and it had also turned their eyes green and their hair white. He said their space flights hadn't been detected because they used antimatter shields, which you needed anyway at high speed to beat friction. He told me so many things, and I wish he hadn't now. Right then, all I wished was that I wasn't going. He stopped the car at the point he'd stopped it when we came in, and I looked down the 2 miles and saw the sun was setting and everything had begun to glow. The ragooses glowed, and the lake glowed, and the kites wheeled in the sky above. I could hardly bear to leave it. I thought the fantastic things had all finished for me now, which shows how wrong you can be, for the most fantastic were just coming. And that's the end of chapter 24.